Southern Iraq, February 1991. Just past dawn. A Soviet-built T-72 tank rumbles forward across the flat, dusty terrain near the Kuwaiti border. The platoon moves in a diamond formation, 4 tanks wide, 1 trailing behind. The crew is calm. The radio crackles in Russian-accented Arabic. Visibility is low, but there's no sign of contact. Then, it happens. Without warning, the lead tank explodes. A column of fire and steel punches upward as the turret launches 30 meters into the air, an arc of destruction that ends in silence. The crew is gone. Inside the second tank, panic sets in. The gunner spins the turret, searching for a target. The commander yells, "Where is it? What hit them?" Dust and smoke obscure the horizon. No aircraft overhead. No enemy in sight. Just wind. 6 seconds later, another hit. The second tank ignites from the rear, engine compartment pierced clean through. Ammunition cooks off. Fire engulfs the hull. The driver tries to escape. He doesn't make it. 2 tanks destroyed in under 10 seconds. Still no target identified. The third tank reverses. Its commander scans frantically through the periscope. He sees something, just for a second. A shimmer on the horizon. Then comes the impact. The round tears through the frontal armor, exits through the side plate, and continues for another 400 meters before burying itself in sand. Now the platoon is in chaos. Only 2 tanks remain. No one knows where the fire is coming from. 1 tank fires back, blind, at a possible ridgeline. The shell misses by half a kilometer. And then, the 4th tank explodes. The 5th crew doesn't wait. The hatch opens. The commander jumps out, waving a white cloth. Anything to survive. In less than 2 minutes, 4 T-72s are gone. There were no warning signs, no radar pings, no aircraft spotted. Just invisible death from the desert. Across the battlefield, hidden in defilade, an M1 Abrams remains motionless. Its thermal sight is locked on the last target. The gunner's voice is calm. "Target, T-72, 1-800, fire." A split second later, the cannon booms. The shell streaks across 2 kilometers of open terrain. 1 more turret flies. No American tank has been hit. From a Soviet perspective, this shouldn't be happening. Not to the T-72, the pride of the Warsaw Pact. Not at this range. Not this fast. They were promised dominance through armor and numbers. Instead, they were being erased before they could fight. Moscow had promised supremacy. The desert gave them silence and fire. Summer 1990. Baghdad. In a darkened conference hall inside the Iraqi Ministry of Defense, Soviet military advisors gathered for a technical briefing. Along the walls hung photographs of Soviet tank parades, T-72s gleaming under red square sun. In the center of the room, a scale model of the Iraqi front line shimmered under fluorescent lights. Dozens of tiny T-72s dotted the table like chess pieces, steel dominance in miniature. A Soviet colonel walked to the front, cigarette trailing smoke, and tapped a finger on the board. "Here," he said, "we have 400 main battle tanks, T-72M variants. The Americans, they will not challenge this line directly." Another officer laughed. "If they do, they'll bleed oil." Around the table, Soviet engineers and intelligence officers reviewed American tank specs, copied from defense journals and field reports. The M1 Abrams was known, its 120mm gun, gas turbine engine, and composite armor all carefully documented. But few in the room took it seriously. One general leaned back and exhaled slowly. "It's over-engineered," he declared. "Too heavy, too expensive, too fragile for the desert. The gas turbine? It drinks fuel like a bomber. How long can it even stay in the field?" A major added, "Their fire control is digital, yes, but electronics break. Sand, heat, vibration. How will computers fare under real shock?" They smiled. They nodded. To them, the M1 Abrams was a theoretical threat, a parade tank dressed in sensors and electronics. But it wasn't battle-hardened. It wasn't proven in real war. And unlike the T-72, it hadn't been exported across dozens of countries, operated by generations of crews, repaired in field camps under rocket fire. One Soviet tank commander laughed and waved the Abrams away with a gesture. "It's a rich man's toy," he said. "Ours is a soldier's weapon." They pointed to the T-72's 125mm smoothbore gun, still one of the largest ever mounted on a tank. They cited its autoloader, no loader required, its squat silhouette, its narrow profile, its reputation in Afghanistan, in Syria, and in the Iran-Iraq War. It was fast, low, and deadly. And most important, there were many of them. American tanks might be more sophisticated, but quantity was its own quality. That was the Soviet mantra. Massed armor would always prevail, and in the open desert, they believed, the Americans would be dragged into a battle of attrition. They were wrong. Because what they didn't understand, what they couldn't imagine, was that the M1 Abrams didn't need to trade fire with a T-72. It could kill it from beyond the T-72's effective range. And it would do so with clinical precision. And their laughter was the first mistake. Since the 1960s, Soviet armored doctrine had followed a brutally elegant logic. Crush the enemy with speed, numbers, and concentrated firepower. Their tanks weren't built to duel, they were built to swarm. The T-72 was the product of this mindset. Weighing just over 40 tons, it was compact, fast, and cheap to produce. It carried a powerful 125mm smoothbore gun operated by a crew of just 3, thanks to an automated loading system. Its low silhouette made it harder to spot. Its armor, while not revolutionary, was considered good enough, especially when supported by dozens more just like it. The doctrine that shaped it was known as deep battle. It emphasized rapid breakthrough, mobile artillery support, and the constant pushing of fronts. Soviet planners imagined wars where thousands of tanks surged forward in waves, overwhelming slower Western forces with volume and momentum. Defensive engagements? Rare. Tank-on-tank standoffs? Short. Survivability wasn't about enduring hits. It was about never being hit twice. Against this backdrop, the T-72 was seen as a battlefield scalpel. Fast, aggressive, and deadly when used in formation. Its gun could fire both armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds. Its autoloader shaved seconds off reload time. Its systems were mechanical, not digital, easier to repair in field conditions. Soviet war games assumed that if a Western tank got within 1,500 meters, it was already too late for them. They never planned for engagements at 3,000 meters. They never planned for tanks to fight at night or in sandstorms using infrared targeting. They never expected real-time GPS targeting or fire control computers calculating moving shot solutions in milliseconds. They assumed vision would be limited, that combat would be chaotic, that the first to shoot might miss, and the second would win. What they didn't anticipate was a tank that could see through the chaos, lock targets from miles away, and hit them before the enemy even knew it was there. The T-72 wasn't designed to counter that. It was never built for a world of sensor fusion and digitized warfare. Its optics were outdated. Its fire control relied on manual range estimation. Its turret rotation was slow. Its armor was steel laminate, a design inherited from the 1960s. In theory, a T-72 could destroy an Abrams. In practice, it rarely saw one before being destroyed. The doctrine of mass had no answer for precision. The doctrine of speed had no answer for information. The T-72 wasn't obsolete because it was weak. It was obsolete because the battlefield had moved to a place it couldn't follow. The Soviets had built a tank for the last war. The Americans had built one for the next. The first real engagement between an M1 Abrams and a T-72 didn't play out like a duel. It wasn't a chase across sand dunes or a contest of reflexes. It was something much colder. February 25, 1991, near the Rumeila oil fields. A U.S. armored unit, 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, was conducting reconnaissance in force. Their thermal sights pierced the early morning haze, revealing a formation of tanks several kilometers away. Boxy silhouettes. Soviet design. T-72s. At 2,800 meters, the American commander gave the order: halt and engage. Inside the lead Abrams, the gunner's thermal scope showed glowing targets, 5 in formation, moving slowly, unaware. The ballistic computer fed a solution in under 2 seconds. Wind, range, lead, ammunition type, all factored in automatically. Target acquired, firing. The first 120mm depleted uranium round screamed across the desert. It struck the lead T-72 just below the turret ring. The impact was instant and final. The turret detached from the hull in a vertical spray of fire, ammunition, and steel. Before the Iraqis had time to react, a second round was already chambered. Another tank hit. This one from the side. Fireball. No survivors. The T-72s scrambled to return fire, but they couldn't see the enemy. The sand distorted their optics. Their rangefinders were manual. Their turret traversal lagged. One gunner fired blind. The shell landed 600 meters short. Another tank tried to reposition, but was hit in motion. The round entered the side armor and detonated the ammunition rack. The tank split open like a cracked egg. All 5 T-72s were destroyed in less than 90 seconds. No American tanks were hit. No counterfire was recorded as even close. The Iraqi crews were trained, but not prepared for what they faced. Soviet advisors had told them the Abrams was overrated, that the 125mm gun could penetrate it from the flank, that American tankers relied on technology, not skill. But this wasn't a duel of men. It was a duel of timelines. The Abrams saw before the T-72 could acquire. It aimed before the T-72 could calculate. It fired before the T-72 could think. And when the T-72 did fire, its shells bounced. On frontal hits, the rounds shattered against Chobham composite armor. Even side shots often failed to disable. One Iraqi commander radioed in disbelief. "We hit them. Nothing happens. Then we are gone." Soviet manuals had no chapter for this. No diagram for a tank that could kill from beyond sight. No model where the hunter never became the hunted. From a distance, it looked like a training exercise. Precision, timing, no stress, no loss. But to the Soviet-trained crews inside those T-72s, it was something else. A mechanical execution. This should not have been possible. When the first combat reports arrived in Moscow, they were met with immediate skepticism. Burned-out T-72s, entire armored columns neutralized in minutes, no American casualties, no tank losses, commanders captured without firing a shot. The Soviet General Staff couldn't accept it. At a morning briefing in the Ministry of Defense, senior officers reviewed intercepted NATO communications and battlefield footage aired by CNN. Abrams tanks rolled past, destroyed Iraqi armor, turrets blown clear off, crews gone without a trace. Satellite photos confirmed the devastation. Column after column of Iraqi tanks, mostly T-72s, had been reduced to smoldering wreckage. A colonel dismissed the images. "Propaganda," he said. "Staged for Western media. The Abrams is a support tank, not a breakthrough weapon." An engineer from the Uralvagonzavod Design Bureau spoke up. "There are reports of frontal penetrations. But the T-72's glacis plate can withstand all known AP rounds. This must be an error. Perhaps the Iraqis used downgraded armor." Another officer chimed in. "Their training is poor. They mishandle their optics. They don't know how to camouflage. They drive in open formation." No one considered that the T-72 had simply been outmatched. Instead, the reports were filtered through a prism of denial. Blame the terrain. Blame the weather. Blame the Iraqis. The logic was circular. The Abrams couldn't be that good. So something else must be wrong. Even in the KGB's internal assessments, doubt dominated. American tanks do not possess significant advantage in armor. Their fire control is unproven in combat. Iraqi losses likely due to morale collapse or leadership breakdown. But off the record, unease grew. Privately, GRU officers admitted they had underestimated the scale of American investment in fire control and crew survivability. Whispers of composite armor stronger than anything in the Soviet inventory circulated in technical circles. Some suspected that the Americans had fielded a newer variant, something beyond the M1 A1, never shown in public. A tank that didn't exist on paper, but was slaughtering T-72s in reality. Still, the official line held. "No tank," a general said, "survives a head-on shot from a 125 millimeters. No tank engages effectively beyond 2,000 meters. These claims are exaggerations, isolated incidents." And so, the lie continued. They believed what was comforting, not what was real. Because to accept the truth that the M1 Abrams was a generation ahead meant admitting that the T-72, the pride of Soviet armored engineering, had become obsolete. And worse, that it had never truly been tested until now. They chose illusion over impact. As the dust of denial settled, Soviet analysts began assembling a counter-narrative, one rooted not in truth, but in salvageable pride. They called it the vulnerability window theory. The premise was simple. The Abrams was not invincible, merely well-protected in frontal engagements. If struck from the side or rear, the T-72's 125mm gun would still prove lethal. It was a theory designed not to explain reality, but to preserve dignity. Technical bulletins circulated through tank divisions and R&D centers. Charts were drawn. Angles of attack calculated. Diagrams compared penetration values against hypothetical weak points. Abrams' armor is thick, yes, one report read, but only forward-facing. At 60-degree side exposure, T-72 has 68% kill probability. They ignored that most of those side shots never came. Even when Soviet block training scenarios were revised to simulate Abrams encounters, they relied on artificial constraints, shorter engagement ranges, poor American accuracy, ideal flank setups. Another line of reasoning emerged: logistics. The Abrams is a gas guzzler, one analyst wrote. Its turbine engine consumes over 300 liters per 100 kilometers. It cannot survive prolonged operations. In extended warfare, it will stall. Fuel consumption became a mythic weakness, an imagined Achilles' heel that Soviet doctrine could exploit, if only given the chance. But in Desert Storm, refueling convoys moved seamlessly, GPS-tracked and logistically unmatched. The weakness never materialized. Then came the optics argument. Soviet engineers suggested that American thermal sights were being overhyped. In clear conditions, standard optics are sufficient, claimed one report. Thermals offer little advantage in daylight desert combat. They ignored the fact that Abrams gunners were identifying and killing T-72s through sandstorms, smoke, and at night, engagements where Soviet tanks were effectively blind. Still, the theory held firm in official circles. In every failure, they found a rationalization. T-72s were hit from ambush. Crews were inexperienced. Ammunition was stored improperly. Targets were misidentified. One document, circulated internally within the 38th Research Institute, made the claim that 95% of Abrams victories were due to battlefield control and air support, not tank superiority. It was a comfortable fiction. A world where doctrine had not failed, only the application of it, where the tank hadn't lost, only the crew. Where the T-72 was still competitive, just unlucky. What no one admitted was that the M1 Abrams was never playing the same game. It didn't wait to be flanked. It didn't need surprise. It didn't depend on weather. It simply saw farther, fired faster, and killed instantly. The Soviet Union had built its tank force for the Battle of Kursk, but the Americans had built theirs for the battles of tomorrow. And the T-72, no matter the theory, no matter the excuse, couldn't survive that future. But the anomalies kept multiplying. As battlefield reports grew more grim and kill ratios more lopsided, a darker, stranger theory began to emerge, one born not of data, but of desperation. This time, the problem wasn't the tanks. It was the battlefield itself. Certain Soviet intelligence officers began to circulate a theory inside the Ministry of Defense that the M1 Abrams wasn't winning because it was superior, but because it was cheating. According to this view, American tank crews weren't engaging Iraqi forces fairly. They were relying on overwhelming satellite guidance, airborne command relays, and even ground-based psychological operations to disorient tank battalions before a single shot was fired. One internal GRU memo suggested that the U.S. had embedded special forces ahead of the armored push, sabotaging Iraqi fuel dumps, cutting communication lines, and manipulating GPS coordinates to disorganize mechanized brigades. Another claimed the Abrams was operating in tandem with space-based targeting systems that gave it instant awareness of all enemy positions. The implication: Iraqi tank crews were walking into pre-loaded kill zones, unaware they'd already been outmaneuvered. A more fringe theory proposed that Abrams units were exploiting radio intercepts to predict Iraqi movement, perhaps even jamming commands between T-72s and their supporting infantry. There were whispers of fake retreats, decoy movements, misinformation campaigns spread through prisoner releases and battlefield broadcasts. None of it could explain how American tanks were hitting Iraqi armor with surgical accuracy from kilometers away in sandstorms. But for officers unwilling to accept technical inferiority, it was easier to believe the Americans were playing a different game altogether, one of trickery and unseen assets, not firepower. And so, reports were rewritten. An engagement at 2,500 meters was chalked up to satellite targeting. An Abrams striking from concealment became pre-planned ambush with air support. Thermal imaging superiority was labeled external reconnaissance assistance. The Abrams crews weren't better trained, they said. They were being coached by satellites, by AWACS, by spies. A Soviet officer at a KGB technical committee summarized it coldly. If they win, it's not because of their tanks. It's because of their reach. But this theory collapsed under scrutiny. Satellite coverage in 1991 wasn't omnipresent. Special forces couldn't be everywhere. And the same technological tools were available to Soviet engineers, yet had never been implemented with comparable effect. Still, the excuses multiplied. Because accepting the truth meant acknowledging that a peer adversary had not only surpassed Soviet tank design, but rewritten the very rules of engagement. And that was unthinkable. So instead, the blame was pushed outward, onto the battlefield, onto tactics, onto fiction. They told themselves the Abrams couldn't be that fast, couldn't be that precise, couldn't be that deadly. Because if it was, then the T-72 was more than outdated. It was defenseless. They were solving a problem that didn't exist. In the months leading up to Operation Desert Storm, the Soviet Union was watching, intensely. GRU operatives were embedded in Iraqi divisions. KGB analysts monitored U.S. military deployments. Radio intercepts, satellite images, and diplomatic cables all funneled into Moscow's central intelligence nodes. And yet, when the M1 Abrams rolled across the desert, killing T-72s in minutes, the Soviet Union was caught completely off guard. It wasn't just a battlefield failure. It was an intelligence collapse. The GRU had known about the Abrams since its prototype stages. They had tracked its production numbers, noted its turbine engine, and gathered rough specs on its main gun. But everything they believed about the tank was filtered through a flawed lens, comparison to the T-72. They saw weight. They saw fuel consumption. They saw electronics. And they assumed complex, fragile, unsustainable. They missed the real picture. First, they underestimated Chobham armor, developed in the UK and refined in the US. It was a composite of ceramics, steel, and depleted uranium layers, a modular system far more resistant than traditional steel laminate. Soviet analysts assumed it was a propaganda term for reactive plating. In reality, it rendered standard Soviet AP rounds useless from nearly all frontal angles. Second, they misunderstood digital fire control. While Soviet tanks relied on optical rangefinders and gunner estimation, the Abrams used a fully digitized ballistic computer. It factored wind speed, barrel temperature, target speed, and terrain. It turned every shot into a guided missile. GRU documents called it too delicate for real war. But those delicate systems were scoring kills in sandstorms at 2,500+ meters. Third, they ignored battlefield networking. Each Abrams communicated via encrypted radio with support units, forward observers, and command elements. Fire missions were coordinated in seconds. Targets were designated, relayed, confirmed, while Iraqi units operated in radio chaos. Soviet doctrine had never imagined tanks as part of a seamless digital network. Their view of armor was still analog. Fourth, they overlooked crew survivability systems. The Abrams blowout ammunition compartment, with blast panels that vented upward, meant that even catastrophic hits didn't kill the crew. In T-72s, ammunition lined the turret ring. When penetrated, the result was a flash fire that incinerated the tank from within. Fifth, and most damning, the entire Abrams development process was invisible to Soviet spies. The project had been heavily compartmentalized. Only a few factories produced the modules. Testing was done at isolated ranges under satellite denial protocols. Even defectors couldn't give the full picture, because no one person ever had it. KGB efforts to acquire technical specs met dead ends. Western contractors used black budgets. Engineers were rotated. No photos leaked. No documents surfaced. What little intel the Soviets did collect, they misunderstood. A blurry photo of an Abrams was dismissed as a variant of the M60. A captured manual was written off as doctrinal theory. They didn't know what they were looking at until it was too late. When the first wrecked T-72s arrived back in field reports, turrets split, hulls burned through. The Soviets searched for flaws in the battlefield. They never realized the flaw was in their assumptions. Because while they had been watching the Abrams, they had never understood it. They were looking at a tank, but didn't understand the system behind it. The M1 Abrams wasn't just a tank. It was the physical embodiment of an American philosophy of war, one where survival wasn't achieved by armor thickness alone, but by seeing first, shooting first, and never being seen at all. To understand why the T-72 had no chance, one has to break down the true nature of the Abrams system. Not just its gun or engine, but the seamless integration of every piece, every function, every second. Start with the gunner's eye. The Abrams was equipped with the gunner's primary sight, thermal imaging system, GPS-TS. This wasn't a luxury, it was a revolution. Where Soviet tanks relied on daylight optics and infrared searchlights, Abrams gunners saw through sand, smoke, and darkness. Heat signatures lit up enemy armor long before the human eye could spot them. In the Iraqi desert, where visibility collapsed with every breeze, the M1's thermal system made T-72s glow like beacons. Next, fire control. Once the target was identified, the Abrams digital ballistic computer took over. Wind speed, barrel wear, humidity, movement of the target, every factor was calculated in milliseconds. The gunner placed a reticle on the target and fired. The round hit, often on the first shot, at over 2,500 meters. By contrast, the T-72's fire control was mechanical. It required the gunner to estimate range, adjust manually, and compensate with guesswork. Under pressure, in motion, in sand, misses were almost guaranteed. Now the armor. The Abrams wore Chobham composite armor, a layered structure of ceramics, metals, and, in later versions, depleted uranium inserts. It wasn't just resistant to standard shells. It nullified them. Soviet APF-SDS rounds, designed to punch through steel, shattered on impact. Even when they hit, they rarely penetrated the vital crew compartments. Meanwhile, the T-72's armor, based on Cold War-era steel laminates, was designed to defeat 105mm shells, not the kinetic energy monsters the Abrams fired. Then, survivability. The M1's ammunition storage was revolutionary. Shells were kept in a sealed compartment separated from the crew. If the tank was hit and the ammo cooked off, blowout panels vented the explosion upward. The crew often survived. In a T-72, ammo was stored around the turret ring. Exposed. A single penetration often triggered a catastrophic jack-in-the-box detonation, launching the turret skyward and killing everyone inside. Mobility? Despite its 60-ton frame, the Abrams was powered by a 1,500 horsepower gas turbine engine. It accelerated quickly, traversed sand effortlessly, and maintained high speed across broken terrain. While Soviet analysts mocked its fuel consumption, they missed the truth. The Americans had the logistics to feed it. T-72s, by comparison, were nimble on paper, but in Iraq, struggled in the deep desert, bogged by weight-to-power limitations and poor maintenance. Comfort matters too. Inside the Abrams, the crew had air conditioning, stabilized sights, room to breathe and operate. Fatigue was lower. Efficiency was higher. T-72 crews operated in stifling heat, hunched over cramped controls, often relying on thin periscopes and minimal field of view. Accuracy degraded with every hour in the sun. And then, the system. Abrams didn't operate alone. It was the armored fist of a larger digital network, linked to satellite reconnaissance, AWACS aircraft, GPS coordinates, and real-time battlefield data. Commanders could coordinate dozens of tanks simultaneously, relaying target information faster than any Soviet division had ever imagined. When one Abrams engaged, a dozen others moved into position. The T-72 fought as a tank. The Abrams fought as a node in a system of systems. This was the true American innovation. Not just better armor, not just better optics, but integration, fusion, superiority by unity. Where the T-72 fired and prayed, the Abrams calculated and confirmed. Where Soviet tank doctrine imagined duels, the Abrams delivered executions. This wasn't just technology. It was the death of the old battlefield. The T-72 was never truly inferior in isolation. It was simply never designed for this war. And in this war, the M1 Abrams didn't win with brute force. It won with total awareness, total control, and total confidence. February 26, 1991. The Battle of 73 Easting. It would become one of the most lopsided armored battles in modern history. Not because of numbers, but because of vision. It wasn't a clash of equals. It was a revelation. The U.S. 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment was moving east through southern Iraq, tasked with locating and destroying elements of the Iraqi Republican Guard. On paper, it was a fair match. American M1 Abrams tanks and Bradley IFVs versus dug-in T-72s and BMPs. Soviet advisors had helped the Iraqis plan their defensive lines. They expected an exchange of fire, maybe a draw. What happened instead was clinical annihilation. At 3:10 p.m., through the swirling dust of a desert storm, the lead American scouts spotted thermal contacts. Dozens of armored vehicles spread across ridgelines and shallow depressions. Iraqi T-72s, unaware of being watched, sat still. Engines cold. Turrets aimed west. The American commander, Captain H.R. McMaster, gave the order. Engage. The Abrams tanks fired first, from nearly 2,800 meters. Their thermal sights cut through dust and heat distortion like it wasn't there. The first volley destroyed multiple tanks before the Iraqis even knew they were being targeted. Then the Americans closed in. As the tanks advanced, the killing accelerated. T-72s attempted to return fire, but missed. Their optics, built for Central European plains, were overwhelmed by dust and glare. Their manual rangefinders were useless against moving targets at extreme distance. And when they did hit the Abrams, the shells bounced off. Turrets flew. Ammunition cooked off. Some Iraqi crews never even got inside their tanks before being destroyed. The battlefield became a graveyard of black smoke and shattered armor. Within 23 minutes, U.S. forces had destroyed over 50 tanks and armored vehicles. The Americans suffered 0 tank losses. No Abrams was destroyed. Not one. A Soviet-trained Iraqi tank commander, captured after the battle, reportedly muttered in disbelief, "We never saw them, just explosions." Soviet advisors in the area were stunned. This wasn't how the war was supposed to work. The T-72 was supposed to be the workhorse, the spearhead. It wasn't supposed to disintegrate before firing a shot. But it did. And the worst part? The Abrams crews weren't stressed. They weren't panicking. They were calm. Executing trained maneuvers, firing, moving, scanning. The Abrams wasn't just dominating, it was doing so without breaking a sweat. In Moscow, the footage of 73 Easting was reviewed behind closed doors. Infrared tapes showed bright flashes, each one a T-72 dying before it had a chance to fight. Analysts paused the videos, rewound, tried to find the moment where the Iraqis could have struck back. There wasn't one. The T-72 had never been outnumbered. It had been outthought. This was not a battle. It was a demonstration. And for Soviet doctrine, it was nothing short of catastrophic. Because it proved that everything they had built, their tanks, their tactics, their theories, meant nothing against an opponent who could see farther, shoot sooner, and survive hits that would have obliterated their best armor. No excuses. No theory. Just raw, undeniable defeat. Soviet steel had met American vision and melted in its crosshairs. The wreckage at 73 Easting wasn't just physical, it was intellectual. Within days of the battle, Soviet military theorists convened behind closed doors. What they faced was not merely the destruction of tanks, it was the collapse of an entire way of thinking. The core assumptions of Soviet armored warfare had been shattered under the treads of a machine they never fully understood. Assumption 1. Mass over precision. For decades, Soviet doctrine had prized numbers. The idea was simple. If you couldn't match enemy quality, you would overwhelm with quantity. T-72s were never designed to be perfect. They were designed to be many. Disposable. Replaceable. But the Abrams made this calculus irrelevant. One Abrams could, and did, destroy a platoon of T-72s before a single shot was returned. Mass didn't matter if you couldn't close the distance. Assumption 2. Armor as shield. The T-72 was born of the belief that speed and frontal armor could get it into firing range and keep it alive long enough to do damage. But Chobham armor turned that idea upside down. Hits that would kill any Soviet tank simply bounced off or vaporized on impact. Meanwhile, the T-72's outdated protection turned into a coffin under fire. Assumption 3. The crew is secondary. Soviet tanks were built around mechanical function. Human factors were an afterthought. Cramped interiors, no climate control, minimal visibility. Autoloaders instead of trained loaders. The tank was a machine. Its operators were just moving parts. But the Abrams reversed this. The U.S. designed its tank for the crew first. Safety, efficiency, visibility, endurance. And it showed. In battle, American crews lasted longer, performed better, and made fewer mistakes. Assumption 4. Short wars, fast battles. Soviet tanks weren't designed for long campaigns. They were meant to punch through NATO lines in a matter of days. But the Abrams was a warfighter, not a sprinter. It could operate for days in the desert, in heat, in grit, backed by logistics, redundancy, and recovery networks the Soviets never developed. Assumption 5. Technological parity. The most dangerous lie Soviet doctrine told itself was that Western technology was exaggerated, that Soviet design could match anything America built. After 73 Easting, that illusion died. The M1 Abrams wasn't just a tank, it was a decade ahead. And the Soviets hadn't even known how far behind they were. This wasn't just about one battle, one vehicle, or one war. It was about the end of Soviet military confidence. If their most mass-produced, most exported, most trusted platform, the T-72, could be humiliated so completely, what else was vulnerable? Their jets? Their radar? Their missiles? The defeat of the T-72 opened a hole that no number of patriotic speeches or doctored reports could fill. In the deserts of Iraq, the truth was laid bare, not with ideology, but with impact craters. Years later, the desert still holds the wreckage. Not far from the Euphrates, half buried in sand, a rusted T-72 sits in silence. Its turret lies upside down, 20 meters from its hull, split from the explosion that tore through it decades earlier. There are no markers, no plaques. Just sun-bleached steel, scorched earth, and silence. A faded Soviet star is still visible on the side panel. Barely. Wind whistles through the open hatches. The interior is charred. The autoloader is melted into the floor. The crew, if they were ever recovered, are long forgotten. To passing shepherds, it's just another dead machine. But to those who studied it, fought in it, built it, it's more than wreckage. It's a warning. Because the T-72 wasn't just defeated, it was revealed. Not by propaganda, not by politics, but by cold, unstoppable reality. A battlefield where doctrine died in seconds, and steel was no match for sensor fusion, data precision, and engineering discipline. The Cold War ended for most people with the fall of the Berlin Wall. But for tankers, for soldiers, for the men who spent their lives inside machines like this, it ended here, in open desert, at 2,800 meters, with a single round. The ghost of the Cold War doesn't haunt nuclear silos or declassified spy files. It lives in the burnt-out hulks scattered across the sands. It lives in the empty optics of tanks that never saw their killer. It lives in the silence after a shot, when no reply ever came. The Cold War didn't end at Checkpoint Charlie. It ended when Soviet steel melted in American crosshairs.